I will start with a acknowledgement of that we're meeting on the Kaurna land and acknowledge the elders past and present and emerging, and I know Chris is also going to do the same. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Professor Melissa Nursey-Bray, and I'm in the Geography Department, and I'm very, very pleased on behalf of the School of Social Sciences today to be co-hosting this talk by Professor Christopher Raymond. It's being co-hosted by the Environment Institute, which is led by Professor Andy Lowe, who is over here and will be chairing the session, and the Institute for Sustainability, Energy and Resources, which is led by Professor Mike Goodsite, who is here. And thank you to both of them for co-hosting. And also, obviously, thanks to Chris himself for being willing to give us an overview of the IPBES Values Assessment, which will be published, or it has been published now, on the 11th of July 2022. It's a definitive new global synthesis of the state of nature, ecosystems, and nature's contributions to people. And I won't go much more into that because the purpose of Chris's talk here today is to tell us all about it. He was the coordinating lead author on Chapter 2 and has been integrally involved in the whole IPBES process since its inception. But I'd like to introduce him first, and I'll hand over to Chris himself. Professor Raymond is Professor of Sustainability Science, Sustainability Transformations and Ecosystem Services at the Helsinki Institute of Sustainability Science, which is acronymed HELSIS, University of Helsinki in Finland. He's jointly based at the Ecosystems and Environment Research Program in the Faculty of Biological and Environmental Sciences and the Department of Economics and Management in the Faculty of Agriculture and Forestry. His research interests include sense of place, nature-based solutions, the social valuation of nature, and the conservation of biodiversity. Since 2018, Professor Raymond has also been coordinating lead author of Chapter 2 of the IPBES Values Assessment, which he's going to talk to you about today. So you've come a long way, Chris, and we appreciate you giving us the time. I might hand over now to Chris to give us his presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Melissa, for that introduction, and welcome everyone today to this presentation. So, as Melissa mentioned, I was coordinating lead author of the IPBES Values Assessment, Chapter 2, which is the conceptual basis on how to essentially conceptualize the diverse values of nature. But today I'm going to be presenting the top 10 key messages of the whole summary for policymakers, which transcends 6 chapters of the values assessment. First of all, I'd again like to acknowledge the 3 key sponsors of today's presentation: the School of Social Sciences, the Institute for Sustainability, Energy and Resources, and the Environment Institute. So thanks again. But I also would like to recognise that we're meeting on the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and we pay respect to their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationships with the land. We acknowledge they are continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today. So where are we? Many of you know that we're facing a biodiversity crisis globally. In 2019, the IPBES Values Assessment, the IPBES Global Assessment identified that there is rapid declines in, a rapid increase in extinction and declines in species globally, reflected in extinctions of fishes, reptiles, birds, mammals, and amphibians, and also rapid declines in species survival, particularly of corals, but increasingly of birds, mammals, amphibians, and cycads. Just last week, the State of Environment Report in Australia revealed some harrowing trends, in fact, even worse trends than the global assessment. And one of the key quotes from this assessment report was that over the past 2 centuries, Australia has lost more mammal species than any other continent and continues to have one of the highest rates of species decline among countries in the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. And that's reflected in rapid declines in plants relative to 1995, in relation to mammals since 1995, and in relation to birds since 1985. One of the take-home messages of today's presentation is that to enable recognition and integration of institutions that enable recognition and integration of the diverse values of nature and nature's contributions to people is key to achieving just and sustainable futures, not only for people, but also for biodiversity and biodiversity conservation globally. And this is again reflected last week in the United Nations General Assembly Agreement, which made a historic decision that they declared the access to clean, healthy and sustainable environments as a universal human right. So this is really putting to the foreground the need to consider justice concerns and well-being concerns in connection to the status and trends of biodiversity globally. But there are some major science policy gaps if we accept this vision. First of all, there are no comprehensive frameworks that take account of the diverse values of nature across different worldviews and knowledge systems. And I'll be explaining these terms shortly. There's also a few syntheses on how the multiple values of nature can guide just and sustainable futures. So in 2018, 140 countries which are members of IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, approved the commencement of the IPBES Values Assessment to address this gap. So what is IPBES for those who are new to it? It's an independent intergovernmental body which is designed to strengthen the science policy interface for biodiversity and ecosystem services and to support the long-term human well-being and sustainable development. It was established in Panama in April 2012 by 94 governments, but it has since expanded to 140 member governments. And it's supported by the United Nations Environment Programme, which provides secretariat services. There's been a range of assessments that IPBES has supported, starting off the pollination assessment published in 2016, the regional biodiversity assessments in 2018, the global assessment in 2019. And now there's a series of thematic and methodological assessments, which the values assessment forms part of. You might have also heard that the sustainable use of wild species was also published at a similar time to the values assessment. But the values assessment responds to the need to account for the wide range of nature's values and policy to start to account for and manage the current biodiversity crisis and to achieve the sustainable development goals. It's prepared by 82 international experts from 47 countries from all regions of the world. And this report, as Melissa mentioned, was approved and published on the 11th of July. But a few days before that, the whole report was essentially approved in plenary by 144 governments in Bonn. The assessment is cross-disciplinary in that for the first time, it not only engages the natural sciences, but also the social sciences, humanities, as well as the economics. And there was a dedicated reach out to Indigenous and local knowledge holders through a process that included ILK and IPLC task forces, as well as engagement of Indigenous peoples in the values assessment as experts. So what do the results reflect? How were the results generated? Every chapter had their own methods and research approach, but I can talk from a chapter 2 perspective, where we had a range of different systematic as well as scoping reviews, where we sought to look at the literature in different ways. For example, we first of all started off with a systematic review of all literature on the values of nature, starting from 2005, which is when the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was published, to now, focusing on review papers only, resulting in 713 publications that we read through. That was complemented by a stage 2 assessment, which involved engaging with the humanities literature, which is not necessarily reflected in Scopus databases, as well as individual keyword searches and policy documents from national biodiversity strategies and action plans across the globe. And then separately, we used AI, or artificial intelligence, and social learning techniques to review 148,000 publications, which were identified in the stage 1. So not only review papers, but all papers that emerged, And we used machine learning techniques to thematically code those papers in terms of what types of values were being represented and what types of relationships between values and well-being were also represented. And separate to that, the assessment includes a number of case studies where we try to illuminate core concepts spanning geographic regions and addressing common themes across the assessment. So quite a large process involving, in Chapter 2 alone, about 20 authors over a 4-year period. Separate to that, we had multiple author workshops, generally on an annual basis, a first author meeting in Mexico, a second author meeting in Bilbao, Spain, a third author meeting online due to COVID, a summary for policymaker coordination meeting in Cancun, as well as fortnightly and sometimes weekly Zoom meetings among the chapter members to actually coordinate insights. So essentially 30% of my time over 4 years went into this. So quite a lot of time. So all the key messages from the chapter were synthesized into a summary for policymakers. And that summary for policymakers was agreed to line by line, word for word by 144 governments in plenary. And by the governments endorsing this, they basically politically agreeing to this document. So it's a co-creation document between governments, but supported or mediated by scientists like myself. And our role in plenary is to basically ensure that whatever changes they are proposing align with the evidence. If they refute the evidence or don't support the evidence, we can interject and suggest an alternative phrasing. This is different to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and other scientific reports which are generated by scientists. They are generally not politically agreed documents, but IPBES is fundamentally different that way. So some trade-offs have to be made, and I can talk about them. But in particular, Argentina was very active across the whole assessment, and they had a political agenda and some political positions that they were not willing to budge on. And that's reflected in how they proposed wording changes in the summary for policymakers. But I can reflect upon that later. So the main focus of my presentation today is where have we come from regarding the assessment of nature's values, and then going to present an overview of the 10 key messages from the summary for policymakers, covering or moving from section A around conceptualization, B, assessment, C, embedding values in decision-making, and D, promoting value-centered transformations towards sustainability, and then end with some future directions for research. So where have we come from? Many of you may be aware that in 2005, Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was produced by a group of scientists globally. And essentially what this report looked at is, what are the different ways that nature contributes to human well-being? And they conceptualized these different contributions in terms of ecosystem services, supporting ecosystem services like nutrient cycling, provisioning services like food and fiber, regulating services like climate regulation, and cultural services like aesthetic and spiritual appreciation. And they looked at the contribution of these different services to different aspects of well-being, such as security, health, etc. Then the economics and the economic basis of values was largely overlooked in this early assessment. It was largely a biophysical assessment. So a group of economists, both ecological and environmental economists, came together, and what's often referred to as the TEEP group, or the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity group, to look at the different ways that we can economically value nature. And what was drawn upon was this total economic values framework, which separated the values of nature into use values and non-use values. Use values including actual values like direct use, like consumption and non-consumptive use, and indirect use, such as pest control, pollination, water regulation. In addition, non-use values, including philanthropic value, such as bequest value, satisfaction of knowing that future generations have access to nature, and altruistic value, satisfaction of knowing that people have access to nature's benefits, and altruism to biodiversity, including existence value, satisfaction of knowing that a species or ecosystem exists, and option value being a quasi subcategory of use values. However, since the publication of that assessment, there was a lot of momentum in the science policy discourse to look at different knowledge systems and how different knowledge systems and worldviews consider nature. Many may know this multiple evidence-based approach that was published by Tengo and colleagues in 2014, which argued that we need to not only consider scientific knowledge in the science policy interface, but also local knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, professionals' knowledge, traditional knowledge, etc., etc. And not only look at them in isolation, but find new ways of weaving these knowledge systems together across actors, meaning different stakeholders, institutions, groups of people or groups of actors that come together based upon informal or formalized rules, and of course different stakeholder engagement processes. So as a result, IPBES started to think about the values of nature in a much more holistic and larger way. And this figure shows how we moved from the Millennium Assessment in 2005 to the first IPBES conceptual framework of 2013, which moved from ecosystem services to nature's benefits to people, emphasising not only regulating cultural and provisioning ecosystem services, but nature's gifts. And then in 2017, the conceptual framework of IPBES further developed into what we are now calling nature's contributions to people, recognising not only regulating nature's contributions to people, but also non-material and material NCPs from both generalisable and specific perspectives. Also note that the concept of nature has changed from biodiversity in ecosystems to also to consider alternative understandings of nature reflected in this concept of Mother Earth. And Bolivia as a country has particularly been pushing this to take account of alternative worldviews, including those of Indigenous peoples. But I must recognise that these are not the only assessments out there. Some of you may be aware of the Disruptor review. So Sir Disruptor is an eminent environmental economist based out of the UK, who took the economic valuation of nature to the next level by recognising that there are limits to gross domestic product and limits to economic growth in terms of the values of nature, and talked about the need for a more of an inclusive wealth paradigm that not only takes account of produced capital, but human capital, natural capital. Not to say this framing is wrong. I think that has a lot of credits and moves a lot of the economics discourse a step further, but it does not necessarily acknowledge the different worldviews and knowledge systems that we are talking about in the IPBES Values Assessment, and I'll talk about shortly. So we have divergent value justifications out there. Some arguments are based upon protecting nature for its own sake, for its intrinsic value, or for its benefits to humans, i.e. its instrumental values. There's also valid arguments for protecting biodiversity for justice and well-being concerns, including elements of relational values. But how do we understand and begin to integrate values across diverse worldviews and knowledge systems? It's something that really still is a major scientific challenge and a research gap that we are considering in this assessment. So now let's move on to some of the key messages. First of all, I just want to acknowledge the authors of the summary for policymakers. I won't read them all out, but just highlight the co-chairs being Unai Pascal, Patricia Balvanera, Michael Christie, and Brigitte Baptiste. The first key message of the assessment basically acknowledges that the causes of the global biodiversity crisis and the opportunities to address them are tightly linked to the ways that nature is valued in political and economic decisions at all levels. By at all levels, we mean decision-making in civil society, among political actors, in our political institutions. This is also reflected in our constitution, and that's quite apt based upon the discussions we're having in Australia at the moment around the need to consider the Indigenous voice in the constitution, but also in the collective choice rules, the regulations that politicians and government actors go by. But it's also reflected in economic decision-making, such as the resource regimes that we have developed and agreed to over time. Property rights, for example, or the interaction rules that we've set up between financial institutions and the state, and between financial institutions and consumers and households, is another example of a resource regime. The point being that all these rules at different levels impact the way we use resources, they affect our income, but they also affect the waste that we generate. They also affect how we develop and mainstream our technology and infrastructure. What we found in the assessment is that many of these economic and political decisions are based upon values as traded in markets, which is a very narrow set of values. And by focusing on short-term profits and those types of market-traded values, we are contributing to the biodiversity crisis through short-termism. So key message 2 says that despite the diversity of nature's values, most policy-making approaches have prioritised a narrow set of values at the expense of both nature and society, as well as future generations, and have often ignored values associated with Indigenous peoples and local communities' worldviews. This includes the value, what we're referring to as relational values, or values that are developed between humans, as well as between humans and nature, that may also lead to an instrumental benefit, such as fish harvesting, as we see in this picture. So why are values constrained? Why are we only considering a narrow set of values? One of the things we acknowledge in the assessment is that there are different power relationships that affect how values are supported or indeed restricted in society. And we talk about power as being discursive power. So institutions, through their discourses, channel values in certain ways and restrict other values. They also promote or restrict values through the way that they frame their messages in reports, including financial reports or otherwise, which is called framing power. There's also a set of operational powers, which includes rights and access to nature that is reflected in not only our constitution, but also a range of laws and policies, and also in the rules that institutions like universities or companies have. They can channel how values are considered or not considered in decisions. And finally, in terms of structural powers, which are powers that are essentially handed down, often implied, from generation to generation. And we can see this in class-related and gender-related powers that are often implicit in society, but become reinforced across generations. The point we're getting to here is that all these forms of power also interface with different aspects of environmental justice. So they affect procedural justice in terms of which stakeholders are included or not heard in decision-making. They affect distributive justice, meaning who has access to or has rights to use different resources. And it also affects recognitional justice, which is how we recognise different groups, including minority groups or people of different gender, sexual orientation, class, etc., in decision making. So in key message 3, we note that the diversity of nature's values in policy making can be advanced by considering a typology of nature's values that encompass the richness of people's relationships with nature. So at the base of this, what we often call as the onion figure, we have worldviews and knowledge systems. So worldviews are the lenses through which each one of us sees the world. We can look at the world from an anthropocentric perspective, where we focus on nature from the perspective of human needs and wants, and we often separate humans from nature. And at the other end of the spectrum, we can view human nature relationships from a biocentric perspective, where we value the rights of nature and the existence of nature ahead of any human need or want. But the point being that the way we view the world often shapes how we think about values. But equally, our knowledge systems, whether they be Indigenous knowledge that's handed down from generation to generation, our local knowledge that we learn from our families or local groups, as well as the academic knowledge that we learn in institutions like universities, also affect how we see the values of nature. Broad values refer to the guiding principles we have in life, For example, we may have a guiding principle to live in harmony with nature. They transcend context, meaning we hold those values whether we're here in Adelaide or whether we're in New York or some other part of the world. But what the literature shows is these guiding principles influence our behaviour and actions in different contexts. And therefore, we need to consider these broad values in decision making. Specific values have had a lot of attention in previous assessments in the context of ecosystem services. But here we talk about specific values, not only in terms of instrumental values, i.e. how people directly benefit from nature, but also in terms of intrinsic values, which is the existence value or the right of nature to exist on its own, in its own right, as well as relational values, which are the relations between people and place and between people and nature, such as reciprocity, care, and justice, which are often not considered in environmental policy documents. And finally, we talk about value indicators, including monetary indicators for assessing different types of values, like willingness to pay or the stocks and flows of given resources measured in, for example, dollars per tonne, but also social cultural indicators, which are reflections of preferences, but also can be more qualitative, such as identification of themes or sub-themes within interviews, as well as biophysical indicators, so species richness, species diversity, etc., which all have a role in the assessment of different values. One thing that's new to this assessment is we recognise that by considering the diverse values of nature, it creates another layer of complexity. And so we created the life framework, recognising 4 life frames as a way to organise and communicate this complexity to decision makers. So living from frame emphasises instrumental values and how we obtain resources from nature. Living in represents our sense of place and identity with nature, emphasising the recreational outcomes, but also spiritual and other qualities relating to use and experience with nature. Living with emphasises conservation of nature on its own right and supporting biodiversity for its own sake. And living as reflects this idea that some knowledge systems don't necessarily see nature as separate from humans. They're inextricably connected. And this emerged to us through reviewing a lot of cases from e.g. the Amazon, where we found that Amazonian people often do not make this disconnection between humans and nature. They see the tree as part of them. They see their well-being linked to the state of the tree. So we try to move beyond these dualities through the living as frame. So here are some examples of broad values: responsibility, stewardship, harmony of nature, belonging, beauty, health. And here are some examples of intrinsic values, relational values and instrumental values. What we try to get to in this figure is that there are points of difference between specific values, but also points of overlap or common ground. So it's not, often we talk about these values as being totally separate, but the literature shows important areas of overlap that we need to consider in environmental policy and decision making going forward. For example, aesthetic values often overlap or can be related to instrumental values, can be related to relational values, and in some cases can also be related to intrinsic values. Key message 4 of the SPM says that valuation processes can be tailored to equitably take into account the values of nature of multiple stakeholders in different decision-making contexts. However, there are limits to uptake. We found that only 5% of studies in the scholarly literature reported uptake of the diverse values of nature. So in order to improve uptake, we need to think about different steps, including investing in legitimate processes, such as investment resources to achieve a robust process. We need to clearly define the purpose of the valuation by engaging suitable participants and jointly defining intended use of the valuation outputs. We need to clearly establish the scope of the process by identifying which and whose values will be considered and defining the social and biophysical boundaries of the decision-making problem. We need to choose and apply suitable methods in relation to that scope and decide on how to combine different valuation outputs. And finally, we need to think about how we communicate results to inform decisions in a way that enables transparent reporting of results, also recognising the uncertainties and limitations of different valuation methods, and allowing for public contestation, recognising that we don't always hold the same values or the same priorities for management on the landscape. And so this implies balancing issues of relevance, robustness, and resources at every step in the process. So in the assessment, we identified more than 50 valuation methods and approaches across disciplines and knowledge systems, which are available to decision makers to assess nature's values. But we organised these valuation methods into 4 families: nature-based valuation, which focuses on the assessment of nature, physical or ecological components, such as biodiversity inventories, ecosystem service mapping, Delphi methods, participatory mapping of ecological values. Statement-based valuation, which focuses on what people say or express when asked about the importance of nature and nature's contributions to people, such as Q methodology, groups discussions, contingent valuation, etc. Behaviour-based valuation, which focuses on what people do in nature, for nature, with nature, etc. For example, participant observation, travel cost method, cost-benefit methods, hedonic pricing, etc. And integrated valuation, where we combine different outputs from one or more methods to support decision-making. The point being that every one of these method families and the methods within them have different assumptions about relevance, robustness, and resources, and confidence. The relevance refers to the ability to elicit the diverse values of nature in different contexts. Robustness refers to the ability to ensure reliable, accurate, and valid and fair representation of stakeholders. And resources relates to the capacities and other resources required to conduct the valuation. And what we found across the assessment is that each of these methods have different levels of strength in terms of relevance, robustness, and resources. So, for example, with ecosystem services mapping, which is linked to nature-based valuation, it's relevant in that we can apply it in diverse contexts, but we have found issues of representing diverse actors through ecosystem service assessments. And in contrast with Q methodology, we've been relatively strong in identifying diverse voices, but the resources required to conduct the evaluation are quite high. So recognising that this assessment needs to provide policy guidance and policy relevant outcomes, we're thinking about issues of capacity, but also relevance and robustness to support the uptake of these valuation methods. As mentioned earlier, what we found is that despite increasing calls for considering valuation in policy decisions, scientific documentation shows that less than 5% of published valuation studies support uptake in policy decisions. So just to further support uptake, we not only have to think about these different steps that I mentioned earlier, but also need to think about how do we embed different types of valuation processes in the policy cycle. And by the policy cycle, we refer to agenda setting aspects, policy formulation aspects, policy adoption aspects, policy implementation aspects, and policy evaluation aspects. So this figure has a few intricacies, so I just want to check my notes here. So when we're thinking about valuation to inform, we're thinking about how do we advocate or support the integration of diverse values of nature before the start of a policy design. But we also may think about it in terms of justifying the importance of integrating different values after the policy has been formulated. Valuation to design can include policy guidance include cost-benefit analysis, feasibility assessments, and value prioritizations. That's valuation to decide, and valuation to design is about permitting, standard setting, pricing, damage compensation, and estimation. So what we're trying to say here is that we need to start tailoring our valuation to different parts of the policy cycle, but also different purposes of valuation, and they fit into different parts of the scheme. Key message 7 states that achieving sustainable and just futures requires institutions that enable recognition and integration of diverse values of nature and nature's contributions to people. But it's recognised in a range of studies that by integrating diverse values, we can improve decision outcomes for people and nature. We can start to tackle power asymmetries, meaning different power relationships between actors or between institutions. We can start to avoid or ameliorate social environmental conflicts by building common ground between stakeholders who may may hold different values or may have different methods or processes for eliciting those values. And we can also support more inclusive policies, which again feeds into this United Nations agreed goals around reframing human well-being in a much bigger lens, not only for biodiversity conservation, but also for justice outcomes and human health outcomes. So key message 8 thinks about the future. How do we start to embed these diverse values into different pathways of just and sustainable futures? And what we're saying is that we need to shift away from predominant values that currently overemphasize short-term and individual material gains to nurturing sustainability-aligned values across society. And we talk about different pathways through which to consider this. And sorry this figure doesn't come up so well on the screen. We talk about an earth stewardship pathway, a degrowth pathway, a nature protection pathway, and a green economy pathway, each informed by different types of broad values and specific values of nature. So in the earth stewardship pathway, there's focus on local sovereignty, solidarity, and biocultural practices, which takes account of the biocultural diversity in local contexts. The degrowth pathway emphasises reducing material throughput, protecting human well-being, and supporting equitable distribution of wealth across society. The nature protection pathway emphasises protecting biodiversity for its own sake, and the green economy emphasises reform to economic institutions and the technologies and performance metrics we use to support more sustainable and just futures. The point being that there are intersections between these pathways, but also points of disconnection. And we need to think more cleverly as scientists, as policymakers, as companies, to think about how these pathways can interact and can be supported across different sections of society. It's not all easy. And what key message 9 says is that there are different leverage points for embedding values in decision-making. Shallow leverage points, or in other words, relatively easy leverage points, like recognizing the values of nature, and we can do that by undertaking valuation, whether it be behaviour-based, statement-based, integrated valuation, etc. But we may not see a lot of change by purely undertaking valuation. The next, a deeper challenge is to embed valuation in inclusive decision-making by meaningfully including diverse values of nature in decisions. An even deeper leverage point and harder leverage point is to reform policies and regulations by enabling institutions to embrace the diverse values of nature. And arguably even a deeper and more meaningful and powerful leverage point would be around shifting societal norms and goals by mobilising sustainability-aligned values and shifting development paradigms. It's clear that our emphasis on material growth and short-term profits and short-term gains is not working to solve the biodiversity crisis. It's also not working to solve the interrelated climate and biodiversity crisis. We have to start shifting our paradigms and norms. The diverse values of nature helps us start to think about that, but recognising the diverse values alone won't cause that shift. There's a whole range of other factors, including power relationships, norms, etc., which we have to start thinking about in a more holistic transformative change. So we not only have to think about education and technical capacities, but we also have to think about financial and other capacities to support change across society. Key message 10 is about identifying capacity gaps and knowledge gaps to achieving transformative change through diverse values of nature. And essentially what we're saying is that different stakeholders have different capacity needs, including intergovernmental, national and subnational governments and non-government organisations, citizen groups, private sector and media. And they can be divided into motivational aspects, such as raising awareness or desire to consider values, analytical aspects, such as enhancing the ability to select and use different methods, bridging capacity to facilitate learning and reflection among diverse stakeholders, negotiating capacity is about facilitating agreements between diverse groups which may have diverse or differing interests. Social networking is about coordinating across scales and groups, and governance is about making accountable, transparent and participatory and law-abiding decisions across groups. So where to from here? We are expanding the values agenda here clearly. And by expanding the values agenda, we also have to be cognizant about how do we conceptualize and recognize nature's diverse values, not only in an academic context, but even in different decision-making contexts. And there's lots of work to be done there, thinking about how to operationalize these values in different decision contexts. We also have to move from conceptualization to assessment, and that implies designing valuation processes to align with decisions and specific outcomes as required in specific decision contexts. We need to move away from one-size-fits-all approaches to recognizing different decisions have different stakeholders and interests, which have different sets of values, and with those values, there may be different ways of measuring them. There's a lot more nuanced approach to decision-making. We need to make visible the values of Indigenous peoples and local communities in their own terms. By in their own terms, I mean we need to support validation of values within knowledge systems rather than between knowledge systems. So we as Western, or myself as a Western scientist, should not be trying to validate the values and knowledge of, for example, the Kaurna people. That's culturally and ethically wrong. We need to support processes that support validation within a system. We need to document the uptake of valuation into decisions, as well as the barriers and enablers of uptake, which has not been really done. We know that less than 5% have been adopted, but why are they not being adopted? What are the barriers? What are the facilitators? We need to get a better handle on power. As academics, we often avoid power, contestation, and conflict, but that is, we need to celebrate power and power issues as a way that through which decisions can be made, but also a way of better understanding each other. We need to recognise how different institutions express values and also constrain or inhibit different values through the different layers of power I mentioned earlier. And we need to think better about how we envision sustainable pathways to document how nature values play a role in future scenarios and in shaping sustainability pathways going forward. So I will leave my presentation there. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris.
You might want to stand here, Andy, then you get the camera.
So thanks very much, Chris. That was really a fantastic overview, I think, of a very complex history of valuation of nature and systems. There was a really nice presentation, I think, from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessments and the first discussion of ecosystem services, then through the different valuation frameworks, and particularly the understanding that strict valuation of nature-based assets is probably contributing to the biodiversity decline. So some really nice insights there, really nice framework, I think, of the typology and understanding of social systems, power base, and policy based elements. I've got quite a few questions that I'd like to ask. But first of all, I think I might throw it open to the floor to see what kind of questions are coming back from the floor, and I'll keep my questions to the end. So, and any questions to start off with? Patrick.
Thanks, Chris. That was great. The last slide, I think, where you summed up what you thought was needed. What if you had to do it really fast? What would you cut?
If we had to do a really fast,
Just had to get on with it, and all of that is a lot to take on board and get coordinated, because it basically is a long list of all the things we haven't done well.
yeah. Well,
What would you cut first?
well, I think I'll respond to that question by saying, okay, who are we? Are we academics wanting to do further research, or are we policymakers seeking to use the diverse values of nature to influence a decision quickly? If it's the latter, I think there is a lot of data already out there around the diverse values of nature, so that could be assimilated or synthesized really quickly. We have a lot of advisory groups and other reference groups already out there in Indigenous communities and other communities that we can engage with. So that's about making these things visible. But I would argue that the pathways one is probably going to be the hardest, particularly as I see in Australia, that we have quite a neoliberal view around how do we protect nature, very much grounded in markets, and how do we develop an economic benefit in a really quick way. And that, I think, is going to require a lot of engagement and capacity building among institutions, not only commercial and business institutions, but policymakers, and dare I say, us as academics who often are trained in economic theory ahead of these more diverse concepts. So to do it quickly, I think we could go through the first couple quite quickly, but the last steps in the pathway are going to require more work. And that's what I'd be investing in my time initially. Thanks.
So we could probably progress through conceptualized design. We already have processes in place for that. I mean, one of my burning questions, I think, was quite similar. So, you know, I think at the start of the talk, you presented, you know, the kind of dire state of the environment here within Australia. We have the highest rate of small mammal extinction in the world, and that's not going away. That's a historical context. We probably know what the answer is for nature, which is to put into some kind of conservation bond 30% of all ecosystems, and that would probably secure most nature. I mean, sure, you know, we can work it out whether it's 27% or 35%, but probably if you're going to conserve 35% of nature, probably most of the biologists are probably looking towards that as a kind of solution. So I guess one of the questions, just to take Patrick's question, is how do we change power bases in policy and get action to support that 30% conservation target, which probably is a rule of thumb that conservationists are coming back with?
Yeah, good question. I think it's about, as we know, discourse is one element of power, and I think we have to start changing the narrative around how we value nature. And what's become very clear from this assessment is that many decision makers and policy makers don't know that these other valuation methods and values of nature exist. So part of our narrative is to say that there are a range of other ways to value nature, and if we start to bring these into decision making, we may not only support biodiversity conservation, but just and sustainable futures, which is core to the United Nations agreements that we're now seeing, but also the Sustainable Development Goals. And so I would be starting with broadening this narrative, saying we have alternative values out there, we have alternative methods to assess them. And by doing that, we're going to engage with more voices and also enable supporting a range of other goals. But there are also going to be trade-offs. And I recognise that every evaluation method or every policy pathway is going to have its trade-offs. And that's where I'd be emphasising that we cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach to valuation and assessing the trade-off across Australia for biodiversity, or the gain is this, but rather look at this on a more contextual basis around how do we apply the diverse values of nature in specific decision contexts, which include certain sets of actors that have an interest or influence on that decision, and also engage with the values of those actors in those specific contexts. I don't have all the answers here. I think there's a huge research challenge around engaging with these multiple levels of power, because companies or institutions have vested interest in the status quo. That's not only mining companies or other resource extraction companies, that's also we as academic institutions have vested interest in how we see the desirable futures. And I think we need to start to reshape that narrative through engaging with the diverse values of nature.
There was another question. Yeah.
So, Christopher, do you think corporations operate only for the aesthetics of environmentalism, or like, because you're talking about like the side of the document uptake and the role of power?
Mm-hmm.
It's like why do governments don't act like that with the urgency, the almost existential urgency, and for most of humanity and nature? So do you think that there's really goodwill from big corporations? Because I personally think that their actions say absolutely the contrary.
Yeah, I think that's a huge challenge. Maybe I'll respond to this by drawing upon what happened in plenary. So Argentina wanted any reference to economic growth and any reference to resources such as agriculture and forestry to be removed from the assessment, because they felt that, like, the diverse values of nature arguments were challenging their rights to use their resources and to develop new trade agreements and partnerships. But the evidence gives an alternative view that if we're going to support just and sustainable futures, we have to start recognising and embedding these different values and diverse values of nature in decisions. And so we were able to counter that. And this is one of the first assessments which highlights the direct link between economic growth and biodiversity loss, and the need to consider a wider range of values. But to continue to answer your question, it's not going to be easy, because as you said, there are political constraints to considering these diverse values. And we talk about that in terms of institutions being value articulating institutions. They articulate certain values, they restrict others. Governments have a role in that because they lobbied and influenced by institutions and other actors in society. So how we reshape that narrative will require us to think about power at different levels, from how power is framed, how power is perpetuated through discourses, but also how power is involved in our norms and legal rules. And some of those things don't change overnight, and that's what makes it really tricky, because we've got this massive biodiversity crisis that we have to address now, but we also have power constraints that really hold up the whole process. And I think it requires us to think about values and engagement and lobbying and influence in very different ways.
So I think we need to finish by 11, or have we got a bit more time? Let me just check.
We'll finish by 11.
Need to finish by 11. I think we'll take one more question, and then we'll close down. So any of the final questions? Yes, thank you.
Just one relating mostly to the finding 8 and then the subsequent ones related to where you've identified that for transformative change, we need more essentially long-term thinking,
Mhm.
particularly in decision making. Just with regards to the structure of political systems. So, for example, Australian political systems, where the top decision makers are, there within that structure comes a continual change in who's making decisions. Every 4 years, we get different
Yes.
decision makers, and they have vested interest in getting credit for doing something new. And so there seems to be a lot of, and even if we had the best possible valuation tools, there's still an incentive for the decision makers to come in and renovate and rename or completely do away with what progress has been done and reinvent and invent something new, just so
Mhm.
they essentially be cynical, so they get credit for that.
Yes.
How do you have any insights as to how we can get a long-term vision implemented in a structure that actually doesn't help that happen?
Super interesting question. I think this was talked about in Q&A last night in the context of the voice. And I think one way to really consider this is how do we start to embed more diverse values into our constitution? I think this is one of the core arguments that Aboriginal people are now making, that if we want to consider the voice of Aboriginal people, but also their associated knowledge and value systems in policy, by putting them in the constitution, there is a requirement to act despite the political process. How that is operationalized in a given political cycle is another question. I see that as one option. It's a hard option because it requires referendums. But I also think it requires new forms of international partnerships. And the United Nations is having a key role in this at the moment. I see through the agreement that was made last week. I see what's going to be happening in Montreal this December as another key opportunity, where they're going to be agreeing on new post-2020 biodiversity targets. And then the draft document not only considers biodiversity, but also aspects of justice and well-being, which will mandate governments to consider this in their national and state policies because it's part of treaty law. So I think there's no easy answer to your question. I think there needs to be a multi-level action, both international and national engagement, but also NGOs and other organisations have a key role in influencing and advocating. And that's another benefit of this assessment, because NGOs and other institutions will use this evidence to justify certain positions that government has to take or institutions have to take, whether they be commercial, state government or otherwise, that have to, in terms of going forward. So I see a lot of hope there. And I like to leave that message of hope for people, that this provides an opportunity to engage with nature in very different ways. Let's not just think about the doom and gloom. Let's really be advocates for a new future. And let's think about how these diverse values of nature can inform that. So thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Chris. Big complex topic area broken down, so it's understandable, and then with potential ways forwards as well. Just again, like to thank School of Social Science, the Institute of Sustainability and Energy Resources, and the Environment Institute for helping support this and come together around this critical topic area. I think a small group of us will have a bit more of a chat with Chris afterwards. So if you'd like to stay around and have a bit more of a chat with Chris, then that option is on the table, and we'll go and find somewhere maybe to have coffee and a bit more of an informal chat. So stick around if you've got some additional questions. Otherwise, thanks very much for coming.